Greetings, urban farmers, gardeners, and healthy food visionaries. Greg Peterson here, and welcome to the 259th episode of the Urban Farm Podcast, where 3 days a week we work together educating and inspiring you to become part of your food revolution. Growing plants that thrive in your yard is a lot easier than you think. It starts with saving your own seeds and letting them remember what they already learned. Just text SEEDS to 33444 or visit iwanttosaveseeds.com and you will receive our free webinar about why seeds matter, why saving them is easy, and how to save your own. On today's podcast, we have someone who is getting down deep into the food revolution. We're talking to David Montgomery about bringing our soil back to life. David is a MacArthur Fellow and professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington. He is an internationally recognized geologist who studies landscape evolution and the effects of geological processes on ecological systems and human societies. An author of award-winning popular science books, he has been featured in documentary films, network and cable news, and on a wide variety of TV programs, including Nova, PBS NewsHour, Fox and Friends, and All Things Considered. David has written 2 books on soil, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life, and The Hidden Half of Nature, The Microbial Roots of Life and Health, which he co-wrote with his wife, Anne Beckley. Welcome to the show today, David.
Hey, well, thanks, Greg. It's a pleasure being here.
Hey, always like talking about soil here, so...
Oh, good.
I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at today?
Well, sure. You know, when I started an undergraduate degree in geology, I didn't imagine that, decades later I would be writing books about soil and soil fertility and how to restore it. Because as a geologist, you think about rocks.
Right.
But over time, I really came to appreciate the central role that soil has played in the history of human civilizations. I have worked all over the world looking at soil erosion problems, but I've also thought about the problem of soil production. How does nature make soil?
Right.
And I eventually, after sort of writing a book about the history of soil erosion on human societies, and then started looking at the process of rebuilding and regenerating fertility on soils, and eventually down the road, I came to write a book on that, and here I am.
Wow, cool. So in your bio, I read a word that I actually, if I thought about it, I don't know that I heard it before today, and that's geomorphology. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you can break it down. It's like geo, morph, and ology. So the geo is earth, morph is form, and ology is science. So it's the science that studies the surface forms of the earth, otherwise known as topography. So, it's the kind of geology that shapes how the landscapes are sculpted. So you got to look at, the actual geology, the bones of the landscape underneath, but you also have to look at, what erodes soil, what forms soil. Is there soil or is it bare and rocky? What does the vegetation do? And increasingly, what is it that people do to the landscape that is starting to affect how it's not only formed, but how it can support human societies? Right.
So what are people doing?
Well, the big thing historically has been we've accelerated the pace of erosion. Going all the way back to the invention of the plow, we've increased the pace at which soils are being removed from the surface of the earth without necessarily increasing the pace at which they're being replaced or restored.
Yeah.
And with anything like that, if you're using it up faster than you're replacing it, you're, by definition, running out of it.
Yeah.
And this has happened to society after society. A story that I told in my second popular book, which is called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, it came out 10 years ago now, where I looked backwards at the history of farming and soil erosion and its effect on landscapes, and came to the conclusion that the way that people have treated the land is one of the key factors that sets the longevity of human societies.
Or shortens it.
Well, yeah, no, exactly. That's how it's mostly played out, is that societies that have degraded their fertility of their soil or actually destroyed their soil, which is what you see if you look at, say, Syria or Libya today, those are places where we have Roman tax records of really fertile fields that produced high yields of crops, wheat and others. And you look there today, and it's bare rock at the surface. The soil's gone. And the impoverishment that has brought to those regions sort of lingers today, a couple thousand years after the story played out.
And in that case, we're talking a couple of thousand years. As you're sharing that, I'm looking at our soil situation around farming in our country now, and it's being accelerated at a much more rapid rate than a couple thousand years, is it not?
Oh, yeah. No, we've, if you look at sort of rates of soil loss in the U.S. Since the onset of colonial agriculture a couple centuries ago, we've lost roughly half, a third to a half of the topsoil in the U.S. and fully half of the organic matter in the soil that remains in the U.S. But there's some regions, like parts of the Piedmont in North Carolina that I've visited, for example, where there's none of the original topsoil left. The farmers are farming the subsoil, which is not where most of the fertility lies in the natural soil. Right. So how does somebody farm the subsoil, and how do they fix it? Or can they? Well, what actually, if you look at sort of the development and history of sort of innovation and change in agriculture, one of the big reasons that fertilizers became so popular in the late 19th and then throughout the 20th century was that we had degraded the natural fertility of the land to a degree to which that if you added chemical fertilizers, they could really boost yields. If you have a really rich, fertile soil, and you add a bunch of nitrogen or phosphorus to it, you're probably not going to get much of a yield bump if you already have fertile soil.
Right.
They work really well if you have degraded soil to encourage plant growth. Now, there's other issues in terms of all the other nutrients that a plant needs other than, say, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But and those can affect plant health. But just to grow a big plant or to get a big yield without thinking about how many nutrients are in it,
right.
Fertilizers can be very, very, very effective at that on a degraded soil. So, one of the things that has happened in the last century or so in the developed world is that we've come to rely on a suite of farming practices that further degrade the native fertility of the soil, which eventually means that we become very dependent on those practices, fertilizers and pesticides in particular, to maintain that fertility. And that can be a problem if you then run into the potential for things like, say, the price of fertilizer going through the roof as energy supplies dwindle over the next century.
Right.
Or all the associated environmental effects with over-fertilization or overuse of pesticides. And so the other part of your question is how do you regenerate and rebuild fertility? And that's exactly what Growing a Revolution, the new book, is all about.
Cool. So let's dive into that a little bit.
Well, the approach I took in writing that book is one of going around to visit farmers around the world who had already restored fertility to their land. So, as a geologist, I can think in the abstract about how you build soils, how you make soils, but the pace at which nature does it is really quite slow. It takes centuries for nature to make an inch of fertile topsoil. And I wanted to go visit farmers who had actually reversed the degradation on farms that they owned and done it much faster than that. They've done it in decades rather than centuries, and basically asked them, what'd you do? How'd you do it? And go to farmers in different settings, different contexts, North America, Africa, Central America, the farmers that had subsistence farms with virtually no capital involved. So it was mostly manual labor and hand tools. And also on really large, 20,000 acre farms in the Dakotas where it was very technologically sophisticated.
Right.
And look for what are the general principles that underlie success in all those different contexts and settings. And it turns out that I think that there's a fairly simple set of principles which, if adhered to, flip one's orientation in how one farms and puts practices into place that can rapidly rebuild soil fertility, and that those principles apply just as well in our yard in North Seattle as they do on some of these farms. They're good generalizable principles.
Wow. So what is the number one principle?
Well, the number one is ditch the plow. Stop disturbing the soil.
Yes.
Don't disturb soil life.
No
soil life is on your side.
Yeah. My business partner, Kari, talks about when you go in with a plow, it would be like going into a city and plowing up, bringing in this huge big plow and plowing up the city. And it's essentially doing the same thing from a metaphorical perspective. Is that your experience?
Oh, it is. But being a fan of old Japanese horror movies when I was a kid, I tend to view it more as Godzilla rampaging through the city.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Right, exactly.
Disturbing everything, making it really hard to continue the day-to-day life. It's exactly that. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that wasn't fully appreciated at sort of the dawn of the modern agricultural era back in the 1930s and 40s when fertilizers and pesticides really became it started to become the standard approach to farming, was the degree to which this life in the soil is an integral part of the natural system that gives rise to fertility. Mm-hmm. I mean, there were people who were onto this, but the mechanics of how it worked, the actual details of the science of how that worked were not very well known, so their ideas didn't get as widely spread as in hindsight they probably should have.
Wow. So, stop tilling the soil, number one. Number two?
That's number one. Number two would be cover up. Basically, keep the ground covered, and with cover crops, and particularly integrating legumes into what one's growing.
Right.
Because if you think about the problem of soil erosion, of actually losing the soil, and most of the fertility is in the topsoil, those surface layers.
Right,
so
exactly.
If you're eroding the soil, you're eroding the fertility. Keeping the ground covered that's how nature solved the problem. How many times have you gone out into a native grassland or a native forest somewhere and seen like a whole bunch of bare ground? Nature clothes herself in plants.
Yeah.
In great part because that shuts down soil erosion, and that allows building up of the organic matter in the soil that really enhances and builds fertility. So covering up and adopting cover crops would be number two.
Number two. And is there a number three?
There is a number three, and it's adopting all three that really seem to work very well as a system, at least according to my experience in going around and interviewing farmers and trying to see, what really worked. And that third one is grow a diversity of crops. Don't just grow the same thing over and over and over again. And at least 3 or 4 different crops in the rotation so that the same piece of ground isn't always seeing the same crop. Because what that does is that sets the breakfast table for pests.
Yeah.
And so you want to break it up so that if you have a corn one year in a field, that the next year when the corn parasites that landed last year on that hatch out, you don't want them to have a whole bunch of corn to eat.
Right. Yeah.
You want them to have barley or something else, which they don't eat.
So much of this, I teach and learn permaculture, and what permaculture does is observes nature and then kind of mimics nature, and that's really what you're talking about is, because I've heard you reference it multiple times, you're looking at nature and natural systems and how they work.
Well, yes, and it's if you look in terms of a strategy for getting the most result out of your effort, working with a system, working with nature has a lot less friction involved in it than trying to work against it.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the basic ideas behind permaculture are, I think, totally in the right direction. And it's really, I think, what these three practices do all together. And there's lots of different specific practices you could do to adopt those three principles of ditching the plow, covering up, and growing diversity.
Right.
But if you think of what defines the modern philosophy of conventional agriculture today, it's basing it on intensive tillage with intensive chemical fertilizer use and growing monocultures.
Yeah.
That is the exact opposite of all 3 points.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I titled the book Growing a Revolution in part is that I think that adopting these three principles as the basis for thinking about agricultural practices, if we could do that, it would truly usher in another agricultural revolution by cultivating the beneficial life in the soil and putting, those trillions of organisms per fistful of dirt into the realm where they are working for the same goals that we are. That they're helping to support what we want out of the soil, which would be agricultural production for a farm.
Right. Wow. So this kind of leads into this whole notion of regenerative agriculture and regenerative. But before we go there, I'd like you to define regenerative for us.
Boy, that's one of those terms that the agronomists are probably going to argue about in terms of what it really means and so forth. But I've got a fairly simple view of that, and that's one of the privileges, I think, of being an outsider as a geologist. And what I would view as regenerative agriculture is a suite of agricultural practices that builds soil fertility as a consequence of agricultural production.
Oh, I like that.
In other words, the more you farm, the better your soil gets.
Yeah.
That is regenerative agriculture. And the same idea would apply in a garden. Regenerative gardening. Same deal.
Yeah. Well, and I love that you pre-qualified all this by, saying that you can do this in your backyard or on hundreds of acres.
Yeah. That's the scalability of these principles is something that I think is really central to thinking that they could be widely adopted and literally transform agriculture.
So how do we scale it up?
Well, I think that the key is really thinking about those three things: the ditch and the plow, growing cover crops, and diversifying rotations. There's lots of different ways to actually implement each of those. So, if you're on a big farm in the Dakotas, you could buy a big John Deere no-till planter and use that in place of a plow. And you could buy an attachment to plant, cover crop seeds and the same kind of a thing. And it could be a very technologically sophisticated and capital-intensive operation. Whereas if you're on a small farm, it says small subsistence farm in Ghana, you could do the same thing with a machete, which there they call a cutlass. But I'm from California originally, so I call it a machete. But it's basically hand tools where you hand plant the seeds. Instead of plowing, you basically plant through last year's crop stubble. And leave it in place. So the practices would be totally different depending on not just the scale, but the technology that's available, the degree of capitalization that's feasible, all those kind of things that affect a farm. But those general principles would be honored and adhered to in both those different settings. And that's where I found that, again, a big contrast with conventional agriculture is that what we tended to do, and that I talked about in that dirt book from 10 years ago, is when Western agriculture spread around the world, we tended to take practices that worked okay in Europe and try and apply them everywhere, including the plow.
Right.
And that didn't work so well because we were trying to take, diverse landscapes in different climates with totally different crops and apply a single set of practices to everywhere. What we could do with these three principles is instead thinking about how can we adhere to those principles but tailor the specific practices that we would use to implement them to the setting of an individual farm, and even in different places on the same farm. But engage the great untapped ingenuity of farmers about how to actually do those things on their land the way they see best fit, rather than trying to sell them the technique that worked in some other region for some other people in some other decade. Yeah.
Well, and again, in permaculture, we talk about observing your space, and all spaces are different. So then we have to integrate and invent technologies, if you want to call them that work in your space.
Yeah, and that's totally parallel to what I'm talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So you're a geologist. How'd you get to farming?
Well, that dirt book that I wrote was really sort of my gateway into the farming world because I started to write a book about the sort of the archaeological view of geology and sort of how soil erosion had affected ancient societies. And I was reading the archaeological literature and the soil erosion literature. And the more I got into it, the more I realized I was writing a history of farming because that's where the connection was. Yeah. And so it was from this backward look through how farming practices had affected different civilizations around the world that I really started to connect with thinking about farming. And then when that book came out, I started to get invitations to speak at like no-till farming conferences and other progressive farming conferences. And I would go and I'd give my talk about the history of soil erosion. And then I'd listen to the other talks. And I started running into farmers who had really good success at restoring fertility to their land, and they were really excited to tell their peers about it. And
Wow.
I started listening to it and going, oh, these people are onto something. And at the same time that I was starting to be exposed to that, we bought a house in North Seattle that came with a yard that had an old lawn. I like to call it an old growth Seattle lawn because it was, it was about 100-year-old lawn that was 6 inches thick. There wasn't a single worm in it. When we peeled that lawn off to make a garden, because that's what my wife really liked about the house, is it had this big lawn area she could use as a blank slate to terraform it and make a garden. We pulled that off. There wasn't a single macroscopic life form in it. It was basically dead dirt. But Anne started working on it and adding organic matter to it, as mostly originally as just a mulch to keep the moisture in the soil. And over time, we started to notice the soil improve and get darker, and it was getting, the organic matter content was going up because of the way she was gardening. And I started to recognize parallels between what these farmers were doing at scale and what Anne was doing in our yard.
Brilliant.
And that led me into talking to people who were in the conservation agriculture world. Who they're the people who came up with those 3 principles. I didn't come up with those. They've been thought about and talked about. But I became aware of them through this sort of circuitous path, and that led me to think, well, could we really scale this up? And the way to do it is to go interview and talk to farmers who have done it and find out what they did, how it changed the soil, dig a hole in their fields, and then go to their neighbors' fields and dig one to see what their field used to be like. And it was totally eye-opening,
Wow, cool. So we could argue that we have a severe soil problem in this country, one that could extremely impact the future of us being able to even grow food. And what I want to explore just for a minute is the importance of restoring this. What do you see as our future around restoring our soil life?
Well, as I was writing Growing a Revolution, I was, wrestling with the storyline and who to interview and how to do stuff. But the more I got into it and the more people I interviewed, the more optimistic I became that we can actually solve the problem. And the key to me was when I started to realize that almost all the farmers I was visiting had started off on what led them to a regenerative path through an economic hardship. They had, the various different origin stories for them in terms of how that worked, but they sort of all ended up starting to go towards the no-till and then bringing cover crops in and then diversifying the rotations through a series of steps that usually started with they were economically challenged for a number of years and had to change the way they did things because they couldn't afford fertilizer this year, say, or herbicides. So they were sort of compelled to change, and they started seeing their soil improve. And as their soil improved, which they loved, they noticed that they could use less fertilizer. They could use less herbicide. When they went no-till, they used less diesel because they weren't driving their tractor so much across their fields.
Right, exactly.
And by not buying as much of those things, they were spending less, and yet their yields were remaining competitive with where they'd been before, in some cases increasing. So they were making as much money but spending less, so they were more profitable. And this was something that really, sort of worked for them. And I think that therein there really lies this opportunity for, if these regenerative farming methods can rebuild not only the soil, but rebuild the profitability of farms small and large.
Right.
That's a recipe for wider adoption. And why is that so attractive, I think, now? And sort of why is it at this point in history that that's happening? I think it's because if you look at how farming really has changed since the Second World War, farmers have become very specialized, for the most part. This is the average American farmer. They've become very specialized at growing a few things. And they've become so good at doing that the price of those inputs or those crops, which are then the input to the commodity market, is depressed. But what's happened to the cost of the diesel and the fertilizer and the pesticides and the designer seeds? All those things have gone through the roof cost-wise, and it's the farmers that are squeezed in the middle. The people, buying the commodity crops from them and the people selling them all the inputs are doing just fine. So I think that with the opportunity is there to improve the bottom line at the farm scale by using less of the inputs, there's sort of a built-in attraction to people looking at it and thinking, hey, maybe I should try this and see if it worked as well as my crazy neighbor who did it and then made more money than I did.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds to me like, number one, you're really optimistic. And number two, it's a pretty simple fix. We just have to go do it.
Yeah, but I don't want to downplay the effort involved in changing one's practices. That's always a barrier to anyone changing anything, including me and my daily routine, right? I mean,
clearly
part about being human.
Yes, absolutely.
But one of the hardest things for us to do, I think, at times, can be changing the way we think about things. It's the simplest thing in the sense of, you just think about it. It doesn't cost you anything. It's just how you think. But we're not very good at doing that on the fly.
Yeah.
And what we're really talking about doing is changing the underlying philosophy of farming to think about prioritizing building soil health. And that's a very different way that we've tended to think about it from the conventional agriculture perspective of the last century. In terms of principles, they're really easy to conceive and think about. What's harder, and what I think will take more ingenuity for farmers, which I'm perfectly confident that most of them have, is thinking about how to tailor that to their land.
Yeah.
And that could take labor. It could take experimentation to figure out what works best. There's no sort of simple recipe. There's a simple philosophy, build soil health, but there's not so much a simple prescription for how you do it in terms of a cookbook recipe.
Right. Well, because it's specific to each property.
Yeah, or each region. And so if you think of what cover crops should I grow and what rotation should I use, you're going to get a different answer in the Dakotas than in Ohio than in Ghana.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, you know what I love about this conversation is that it gives us hope that we could actually fix this.
I think this problem is very fixable. Whether we will do it, I choose to believe we will because I want to be an optimist.
Yeah.
But I also see those trends lining up where if we can make farms more profitable and lower their environmental footprint, that's a really powerful combination for uniting people across all sort of political stripes and perspectives that, hey, this is a good idea. We should really be promoting this. Now, obviously, there will be segments of society that may not think it's a terribly good idea, and those primarily, from what I could tell, might be those who have a strong vested interest in selling the inputs that farmers rely on today.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's, if you look at the evolution of economies and the aftermath of previous agricultural revolutions, things change. There's always winners and losers in that game.
Right.
But there's no question in my mind that it would be in society's best interest to really promote these farmers who are trying to make the switch to a more regenerative style of agriculture. That's for me, it seems like it's an overused phrase, but it's kind of a no-brainer that we ought to be encouraging this.
Yeah. Well, amen to that. That is for sure. That is for sure. So I'm going to shift on you now, and I'd like for you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you learned from it.
Oh boy! Well, the example I'll probably point out to that is that at the end of my second year in college, I dropped out. I was done with a productive experience in college at that point, and I took a year off. And so one could view that as failure. I didn't make it through in 4 years, which was what everybody thought I would do and what I thought I would do. But I think it was one of the best professional decisions I ever made in hindsight, because it worked out well so that by the time I got back to college, I was motivated. I knew what I wanted to do, why I was there. My grades got back up to the level that I had hoped they'd been at before I dropped out. 30 years on, I'm a professor at a major university and got a MacArthur a few years ago. So it kind of worked out in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we talked about this earlier in our pre-conversation. I kind of mirror that too. I flunked out of Arizona State University the first time I was there because I really didn't want to be there. But then the next time I got there in 1999, I wanted to be there. I was
And I think that's a really good lesson in terms for anyone in college at any level, is that you simply get more out of it if you know why you're there.
Yeah.
What you want out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
When I went back, I knew what I wanted, finished. Then I took another couple years off and then went back to grad school once I figured out what I wanted from grad school.
Yeah. I lucked out. By the time I got back to school in 1999, I was 39 at that time, and I knew what I wanted to do.
There you go.
Yeah, so that I kind of lucked out, and I didn't have to wait. I went directly from my bachelor's into my master's. So my next question is, what do you consider your biggest success? And I kind of want to guide that question a little bit because I want to know more about this MacArthur Fellow Award that you got.
Oh, well, that was one of the nicest surprise. No, that was the nicest true surprise I think that's happened to me. It's that they're a wonderful foundation that, every year gives out what's popularly called the Genius Awards that I think it's September that they're announced. And you don't know when you get one, you had no idea that you were nominated. You had no idea the process.
Wow.
You just get this phone call that says, "Hi, we're the MacArthur Foundation, and you may have heard of us, and you've been selected as a fellow this year." And you're at. My response was like, "Yeah, really? Who put you up to this? Is this a joke?"
Right. I'll bet they get that a lot.
Yeah, well, that's what the guy on the other end of the line said. He said, "Yeah, we get that a lot." It was his exact words. And, you can call the foundation back, ask for the president of it. They'll connect you back to me if you really need to be confirmed about this. And I was like, "You're serious, aren't you?"
Wow.
And that was a really nice thing. They basically give you a very nice chunk of money that comes in over 5 years. And the goal is to promote creativity, there's no strings attached. It's for you to use to further what you want to do if you're an artist in your artistic endeavors, if you're an intellectual in what you study. I viewed it as a writer. It helped keep me in the popular writing game because that came after my second popular book, and I'm on my fifth now, I guess. So that was a major. I mean, it's a real nice vote of confidence in one's work to get, and it opened a lot of doors. It was very nice.
Well, congratulations.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely. So what drives you?
Well, I think in one word, I'd have to say curiosity. I like to know how stuff works. I like to learn stuff. And so, one of the reasons I've been writing books in fields that are a little bit outside of what my academic training is in is that it compels me to actually learn that field, do some research in it, understand it well enough to write about it, but not at the deep technical level, but at the broader level that people outside that field could understand. But I want to get the science right too, so people in the field will go, "Oh yeah, you got that right." Yeah. But I think that what really drives me to do that is, I like learning stuff, and that is rooted in curiosity.
Yeah. Beautiful. So, if you could recommend one book, what would it be and why?
Well, you mean other than one of mine?
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, can I get away with two? Sure. Okay. Well, if I can get away with two, then the first one I'm going to recommend is Charles Darwin's book on worms. It's called on the origin of the vegetable mold. I think it's called. He's basically looking at how soil is formed. But he looked at that through studying worms. It was the last book Darwin wrote in his life, 1881. And I originally started reading it because I needed a book to put me to sleep at night, and I thought that surely a 19th century science book would do that. Damn thing was fascinating, well written, engaging, fascinating. Yeah. And so anyone who's interested in soil and its fertility, Darwin was actually one of the early people thinking about that the right way. And it's a fascinating book. But the other one that I'll suggest is by Lady Eve Balfour, who was she was a Brit, farmer in the mid-20th century, who wrote a book called The Living Soil. And she made the argument, which was decades ahead of her time, that soil health, the state of fertility of the land, directly translates into the health of people. And it goes to her idea was that soil health leads to healthy soil, leads to healthy crops, leads to healthy livestock, leads to healthy people. And she connected all the dots up, reported, she did her academic homework, made a beautiful argument. It's surprisingly readable. And it was decades ahead of her time because the understanding of how each of those pieces are linked really wasn't very well developed.
Right.
But in the subsequent decades, those pieces have started to fall into place. And actually, Ann and I are starting to work on a new book that looks at that very connection between soil health and human health, trying to update Balfour's look at things. Because a lot of the modern science, the microbial science in particular, that we wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature, that kind of stuff is falling into line in ways that really support what Balfour saw. But she was seeing it through all these associations and empiricisms of, when you feed people this, they're either healthy or not. The mechanics were not understood. Yeah. But that's just falling in place. So Balfour's The Living Soil would be my other suggestion.
Perfect. Thank you. What one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
Boy, that's going to be Ann and I have been challenged to sort of summarize our Hidden Half of Nature book with a single takeaway message, and that's the advice that I'll give people is this takeaway: mulch your soil, inside and out. Because the soil, the human gut is just like the soil around the plant roots.
Yeah. Well, and I've heard this before that the more we're out working in the dirt, the healthier we are because we're taking in those microbes.
The surprising amount of our health is related to that. Whether we're consuming them in our food, whether we're feeding the right microbes the right way, and exposure to the soil has been definitely related to health, and surprisingly, perhaps even to mental health in terms of our own serotonin production is controlled a lot by our microbes. How happy we are. So there's studies that have suggested that gardeners should be on average happier than other people.
I'll take it. I'll take it. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, David.
Well, no worries. It's been my pleasure, Greg.
Absolutely. So I just want to do a shout out, Growing a Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life. That's his book. You can find it, I'm sure, on Amazon, and we'll have it on our show notes page as well. So other than that, how can our listeners get a hold of you?
Well, there's sort of two ways. We have a website, dig2grow.com. That's www.dig, the number 2, and then grow.com. And you can reach us through dig2grow@gmail is our email address, or through our website. For those of you in the Twitterverse, Ann and I are active on Twitter, and our call is @dig, the number 2, grow.
Oh, very good. Perfect. You can find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/big dirt. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast. Do you want to save money at the grocery store, eat more organic, whole foods, cultivate food security, and feel more connected to the earth? If so, then growing your own food is a no-brainer. You wouldn't believe how many people come to me claiming that they can't grow their own food. They think they don't have enough space, that they're too busy, or that they simply don't have what it takes. Perhaps you've fallen for one of these gardening myths. If you think you can't grow food, or if you think the only food that you have access to is what you buy in the grocery store, I have a life-changing webinar that you need to see. It's free and will help you unearth your inner gardener. I've helped thousands of people just like you learn to grow their own food, and I'm speaking from my own experience when I say that with the right knowledge in place, there is no such thing as a black thumb. With this webinar, you can begin making your garden dreams come true and start growing delicious, nutritious food for your family. Just text GARDEN to 44222 or go to iwanttogarden.com and you will receive our free webinar about the 7 key factors you need to know to grow your own food. Remember, that's GARDEN to 44222 or iwanttogarden.com.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.